So, hey everyone, my name is Jason, and basically what I'm going to go over today is what we're seeing from an intrusion perspective, as well as best practices on how we can combat these different intrusions. We'll talk about high-level trends and a variety of different things. We'll also dive deep into a few use cases, so should be fairly entertaining. I guess let's see where this goes. So, here's me. I'm the director of the Strategic Threat Advisory Group, and basically what we do is we help our customers operationalize their threat intelligence as well as their threat hunting capabilities. Prior to CrowdStrike, I used to be in a Big Four consulting firm where I built threat intel programs for Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. And prior to that, I was in the U.S. Army for about 7 years, where I did stuff at NSA and Cyber Command. So here's kind of a review of what we'll be going over. We're going to talk at a high level about the purpose of threat hunting. We'll go into an intrusion threat landscape so we can have some of the strategic perspective. We'll do a few tactical observations. I'm actually going to pick some use cases that I think are going to be relevant to you guys. And then we'll talk about how to engage in proactive threat hunting operations. So on that note, let's go ahead and get started. So we'll start with the purpose of threat hunting. And for me personally, it's quite simple actually. What it comes down to for me is this number right here. So we actually took a tabulation of all the AV solutions combined, and on average, and this includes CrowdStrike by the way, so on average, they all stop about 98.3% of attacks. So what that implies is about 1.7% of things are going to get through. So that of course begs the question, so what happens with that 1.7%? So when you think about it, like when you think about how endpoint security has evolved, back in the day, you pretty much only have AV, right? And then, organizations were consistently getting breached, and we realized, okay, that's not enough, right? In addition to having AV, we also need to have visibility, which is sort of where your EDR comes from. It gives you visibility throughout your environment. Now you have the capacity to kind of look at these trends, find a few more anomalies. The challenge of this, of course, though, is that there will still be things that will defeat even EDR as well, because again, both EDR and AV, these are automated detection systems, right? And for a smart adversary, they sort of get it. They understand how these detection systems work. And ultimately, that's the purpose of threat hunting, because it's the acknowledgement that we're not going to stop everything from an automated perspective. No matter how much we want to, no matter how hard we try, there will always be those anomalies they get through. And some examples of those anomalies, let's take some just some basic ones, right? Like a good spearfish, something that actually is able to deliver either a malicious executable or route someone to a malicious URL to where they interface with the URL, perhaps leak their own credentials. There's a lot of things that no matter how hard we try, sometimes they're just going to get through. That would be an example of one of them. Another would be lateral movement. So let's take a case where you have maybe a trusted third party, or even if you have credentials leaked on somewhere like Pastebin or whatnot. There are some cases where, once again, if the actor is doing everything in a legitimate manner, if they're using legit credentials that are functional, then that is still going to work. And then same thing with the ability for actors to kind of navigate around on the machine using native tools, things that once again aren't necessarily going to set off an alert. Like let's take like PowerShell for instance, or modifying legitimate binaries, or using remote administration capabilities such as PSExec or RDP. So like things like that, right? Like there will always be things that technology just isn't going to stop. And even beyond some of those fileless techniques, there's even advances in malware that are really also kind of changing this and making it to where even from an AV perspective, there is sometimes a pretty strong probability that we're not going to stop those either. So here are three examples of what we're seeing from an advanced malware perspective in terms of how these things are causing problems for organizations. So the first one is around banking Trojans that are developed by botnets. So the backstory behind this is I was literally talking to our intelligence lead one time, and I noticed that we literally pumped out 400 indicators for TrickBot within about 2 minutes. And I talked to him, I was like, hey, I think there's something wrong with the indicator feed. They just created 400 different TrickBot variations. And he's like, nope, that's how much these botnets can pump out if they want. They can pump out literally like that much in that small of a time span. So the challenge of that, of course, is now you're going to be overwhelmed by new signatures, things that you've never seen before, and then if you move over one to the right, now you have custom compiled ransomware. So in this case, like let's take a lot of these major ransomware attacks that happened last year. The organizations that got hit by those, they're actually being hit by ransomware variants that were custom compiled just for them. So essentially, again, you're being hit with something that's totally unique that the world has never seen before. And then, then you have the case of polymorphic malware. And then with polymorphic malware, that's also able to change its hash every time it's leveraged. So, you're dealing with a lot of different things that create, again, challenges for AV, challenges for detection, so on and so forth. And just to drive the point home, this is becoming an increasingly costly problem to society. Here are some of the largest ransom demands that we were able to detect as of last year. And as you can see, the numbers are consistently going up. And what happens is that basically the more that these attacks succeed, the more bold the actors feel in terms of collecting ransom payments. Between late 2018 and through the end of 2019, the top actor that we were tracking, Pinchy Spider, collected about a grand total of $100 million in Bitcoin, which once again kind of speaks to the to the severity of this problem. So ultimately, kind of here's the challenge, right? Once again, we have to recognize that technology alone cannot stop all breaches. And obviously, like ultimately, we want to be able to achieve two goals from a threat hunting perspective. We want to be able to harden our security posture, and we have to be able to do this in a cost-effective manner, right? And also in an efficient manner. And then at the same time, in addition to hardening our security posture, we also have to manage costs because all of us operate within budget constraints. We have left and right limits. We have to actually find effective ways to do things that are consistent with the resources that we are given. And there's a lot of considerations here. It could, we want to think about things like risk reduction and the ability to acquire talent and then retain the talent. So all of us are cybersecurity professionals. We're aware that there's a big cybersecurity shortage across the industry. So when you find a talented person, it can sometimes be hard to retain them, which is yet another challenge when it comes to threat hunting. There's SOC security efficiencies. So how do we do things that help reduce the time it takes for us to do those things? That's another objective of threat hunting. And then complexity reduction as well. If we're using a million different tools that have a million different knobs and buttons and they all interact differently with each other, that increases the time that it takes for us to react to events and thereby increases the complexity. So we want to reduce that. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the strategic trends that we've been seeing from an intrusion threat landscape perspective. So overall, intrusions are increasing across the board. Oops, sorry, went backwards. And for some reason, this is loading the wrong way. There we go. All right, so let's take a look at what we saw last year from an Overwatch perspective. So Overwatch is our threat hunting capability. And what you're looking at here is the amount of intrusions that we saw between Q1 of 2019 and Q1 of 2020. As you can see here, the state-sponsored ones remained relatively static. And the logic behind that is nation states, they sort of just have static operations. They have consistent objectives. They don't necessarily surge in size or surge in operational capacity. They tend to operate at a steady state, and the only things that really make them surge are major geopolitical events. Whereas if you look at e-crime, on the other hand, it's the exact opposite. We're noticing a steady e-crime increase over time. And honestly, to be kind of blunt, what this implies to me is that overall as an industry that we're not doing the right things. Whatever we are doing, it appears to not be as effective as it needs to be, which once again really kind of speaks to the problem, right? We have an adversary that's getting stronger, more capable, and they're continuing to find ways to bypass our defensive systems. So, again, this for me is personally a big reason why threat hunting matters. And, one of the reasons I circled this quarter over here, if you see this large spike within this last quarter, in my opinion, that is because of COVID-19. And what COVID-19 has done to us as a cybersecurity industry is that it has increased our organization's attack surface. So think of it like this. All of us are using the internet more than we ever have in the past. We're making phone calls, we're using more applications, we're using more tools, and all of those things create opportunities for actors to come at us across our attack surface. So that's another key theme here as well, that we're looking at this big attack surface expansion, which is resulting in more e-crime attacks. So moving on, intrusions are also becoming more complex as well. So I'm going to introduce a term to you guys, and it's this term right here called distinct and sophisticated. So there are basically two different types of intrusions that we see. There are things that we've seen before, whether it's like PowerShell scripts or command line scripts, and things that we've seen in the past, and we kind of know what to hunt against because we've seen it used elsewhere. And then there are techniques that we've never seen before, and that's what we call distinct and sophisticated intrusions. So literally within a quarter time span, over the last quarter, there has been a 50% increase in distinct and sophisticated intrusions. The challenge of this is now that with these ones, no one in the world has ever, well, at least, and I guess that, let me rephrase that, not no one in the world, but no one in CrowdStrike, which has a global view, has ever seen this before. So that's been very problematic for us. We've also seen an increase in the raw amount as well. So in terms of as of May, so as of last month, we had observed 81% of the total of 2019. And like I said earlier, the majority of these are e-crime, and the actual total number here is 83%. And then also as of May, we've stopped about 18K total breaches, So in addition to an increase in distinct and sophisticated intrusions, like I said earlier, we're also kind of seeing an increase in the volume as well. So in terms of a breakdown, like it says up here, 83% of these are e-crime. And again, it's not that the nation states are doing less, they're just not increasing, whereas your criminal actors are increasing exponentially. The top 4 industries that we've seen be targeted by e-crime actors are the technology industry, manufacturing, financial, and healthcare. And then the top 5 that we've seen being targeted by the nation states are telecom, manufacturing, healthcare, media, and government. And then, of course, there's the COVID-19 factor. We took a measure actually between February and March just to see what was the difference in COVID-19 themed files. And literally you have, it's went from about 10 in February to well over 1,000 within March. So again, we're noticing this tendency for actors to really take advantage of global trends as part of their attack patterns. So the other thing that we're kind of noticing is that attacks are relying more and more on fileless techniques. And just to illustrate this, I'm going to show you the difference between what we saw in 2018 relative to 2019. So in 2018, we saw about 60% malware attacks and about 40% non-malware attacks. And again, non-malware is things like using legitimate credentials, PowerShell, RDP, PSExec, modifying legitimate binaries, those kind of things. And what we noticed was that the further up the maturity of the actor, the better their ability to engage in these non-malware attacks. So for instance, organized criminal gangs in nation states demonstrated a pretty significant capability to leverage those as part of their intrusion campaigns. So in 2019, we actually saw for the first time the non-malware attacks be the overall more prevalent than the malware attacks. So again, this is yet another reason why hunting is critical, right? The more the adversary is able to evolve towards things that do not rely on signatures, the less effective AV will become. And it does not matter how advanced the AV is. AV is designed to detect signatures. And even in the case of, let's say, something like CrowdStrike, right? Like CrowdStrike does a lot of behavioral analysis as well. Again, those things are based off precedent. So ultimately, unless we have a precedent, we cannot create the detections for it. So when you take the fact that adversaries are using non-malware attacks combined, and as well as with the fact that we're seeing an increase in sophisticated and distinct intrusions, that really creates a challenge for defenders in general, because now we're faced with a lot of things that we haven't seen before. So here's what we're seeing by region. Basically, what you'll observe is that the more mature the region, the more likely the adversary is to use malware-free attacks. So obviously you see North America with now, instead of 50% not malware-free attacks, closer to 75%. So again, this is very problematic, right? Because the more malware-free attacks that they use, the less likely AV is going to work. Whereas if you compare North America to Latin America, now you see that the adversary favors almost exclusively malware-based attacks. And the logic behind this is very simple. What it really comes down to is the maturity of the market. So think of it like this, actors are opportunists and they're business people. They want to save time. So like for instance, in the case of Latin America, if they can execute these attacks, using commodity malware and they can automate the process, that's exactly what they're going to do. Whereas in North America, they don't have that same luxury because there's a stronger cybersecurity posture in North America. So again, you'll notice that actors tend to pivot their techniques based off whatever the path of least resistance is. So moving on, let's take a look at malware as well, because again, it's not necessarily just malware-free attacks, but we're also seeing consistent malware attacks as well. So in general, from an intrusion perspective, here's the prevalence of malware we're seeing, and I want to emphasize that these are non-targeted malware families, and what that means is these are the criminal ones that we're seeing. So the most common one is Andromeda/Gamma-Ro. I don't exactly know how to pronounce that, but basically think of it as a modular Trojan that is passed around by Russian criminal communities. It is a common Trojan that they will leverage in order to gain access, and then in many cases, once the adversary gains access, then they'll actually sell that access to someone else who might be more well-suited to exploit the actual access into the environment. Second most common was coin miners, which very simple, just using computing resources to mine Bitcoin. Third most common was Emotet. So in this case, again, a very popular downloader. We have JS Bondat, which is basically a data collector that collects information from removable drives. Quackbot is another popular banking Trojan. And then you have Gozi ISFB, which is essentially another banking Trojan variant. So again, this is kind of the prevalence of what we are seeing from a malware perspective. So let's go into a few case studies. I'm going to open up some ones that I think are relevant for you guys. And the first one that we're going to talk about is something that we saw Wizard Spider do. So Wizard Spider, for everybody's context, is the user of the Ryuk ransomware. So if you guys remember last year, Ryuk was by far the most effective ransomware used in human history. In general, it disproportionately affected 4 types of industries. That was municipal and state government, healthcare, manufacturing, and the education sector. So what you're looking at here is actually a recent attack that we saw leveraged by Wizard Spider, where instead of using their normal TrickBot banking Trojan to engage in the reconnaissance process and the navigation process, they actually because they saw that it was CrowdStrike, they actually used different processes. So I'm gonna explain how that works. So typically the first thing that Wizard Spider will do when they gain access to your environment is they will seek to understand your security software. So in this case, Wizard Spider sought to understand the security software, and they saw that CrowdStrike Falcon Prevent was on the machine. So what they did was they changed up their tactics. Instead of using malware to execute the attack, they used things that did not rely on malware, like process injections and PowerShell, and leveraging Windows management instrumentation, which is a network management capability. So here's the PowerShell capability that they executed, where they're basically looking for different types of certificates and they're looking for information on the system. And then here's the Windows management instrumentation process that they executed, where they're modifying svchost.exe in order to, again, basically steal credentials which allows them to move laterally. And then ideally, in their case, what Wizard Spider is seeking to do is find the domain controller. We were able to detect these 2 techniques because we had seen them before leveraged by Wizard Spider. And at this point, once they executed these techniques, we were able to kick the adversary out of the environment. The next tactical case I have for you is an adversary called Pinchy Spider. So Pinchy Spider, actually, let me back up. All adversaries at CrowdStrike have 2 names, a first name and a last name. The last name is the type of actor, and the first name is the specialty. So for instance, spider actors are criminals, whereas Pinchy Spider means they specialize in 2 types of ransomware. They have the GandCrab ransomware, and then they have a more recent variant called the Re-Evil ransomware as a service. So in this case, what we're actually looking at is a hospitality entity that was targeted by the Re-Evil ransomware as a service. So this has been problematic for a lot of organizations. Basically, with ransomware as a service, here's what's kind of going on here. Let's go back to last year to kind of compare and contrast ransomware to ransomware as a service. So last year on the large part was dominated by somewhere between 5 to 7 really big ransomware operators. And when you think about the majority of the money that was actually stolen last year in terms of Bitcoin, that was done by these really big ransomware operators, groups like Wizard Spider and, Intrsuion Spider, and the ones that were leveraging some of the major ransomware types. This year, what we are seeing is a large preponderance of ransomware as a service. Ransomware as a service is basically when the ransomware operator has affiliates. So each of these operators now have up to about 25 different affiliates. So here's what's going on this year. So instead of having 5 to 7 major ransomware operators, now you have 5 to 7 ransomware operators who each have 25 affiliates working under them. So I mean, let's do some simple math here. 5 times 25 is about 125. So that's one of the challenges that we're dealing with as an industry, right? Now the velocity of attacks occurring against us is happening at a much higher rate because these ransomware operators are now taking on affiliates to engage in part of their in attacks. So here's what this actor did. This was an attack that I think was enabled by COVID-19. So let's think about what COVID-19 did. Immediately we go into quarantine, right? We all have to work from home. And we think about what a lot of businesses went through when they tried to transition to a work from home posture. They're trying to set up VPNs. They're trying to set up, a good RDP capability. And in this case, what happened was Pinchy Spider was able to engage in RDP scanning, and they found an RDP connection with a very poor password configuration. So they were able to engage in a password spraying attack, and they used that to actually get in. So once they got in, what they tried to do was they tried to stop different processes that were running on the machine. The reason these actors will try to stop processes before executing the ransomware is because they don't want you to be able to engage in incident response. A common incident response practice is like, let's say your organization's hit by ransomware. an incident response team will often try to come back in through a hung process to see if they can remediate without getting the decryption keys from the actor. So you'll notice that when actors go in, they will often try to stop these, they're going to try to stop attacks, or I'm sorry, stop these processes. So ultimately, we were able to detect this actor in action. We saw them trying to stop the processes, and we also saw them use a particular binary by modifying svhost.exe. So this was another case where we were able to stop this attack simply by having threat hunting. So again, it kind of really illustrates the importance. And then the last tactical use case I'll talk about is actually a nation state adversary. So for pandas, what that means is China. And what you're looking at is the use of an implant called the CrowdStrike implant. So what China does is they don't have so I guess actually let me back up. So CrowdStrike implant. The way I would think of this is kind of like Metasploit. It is a single malware framework that has a lot of capabilities embedded within it. So once they are in, though, they're able to use techniques that are organic to the machine to navigate around. Things such as process hollowing, process injection, the ability to steal web sessions cookies. And then we saw them leverage several command line techniques in order to achieve their objectives. With this unidentified Panda actor, what they were seeking to do was steal credentials and then navigate around and then ultimately achieve access to a target where which would enable them to engage in industrial espionage. This one was easier to detect than most, and the reason for that is the first step that they leveraged was the CrowdStrike implant, and we had active indicators and YARA hunts to be able to detect against that one, so that was helpful. And then also some of the stuff that they did was very noisy, and we were able to detect it relatively quickly. But once again, though, this is another use case where without the threat hunting capability, we may not have actually been successful. So those are our tactical examples, and now we're going to talk about how to engage in proactive threat hunting operations. So in my experience with threat hunting, it sort of comes down to three big things. Like when you think about your own threat hunting operation, there are really three big factors that you want to consider. The first is data invisibility. So you have to have something to hunt against. You can have the most talented people in the world, and the most talented people could have all the coolest and best tools in the world. But if you don't actually have a data source and you don't have visibility on that data source, then you're not going to be able to hunt against it. So that's one factor, right? And then of course the other factor is the human expertise. So I keep on going back to this, and that you can't automate everything. So if there is something that you're looking at like an automated threat hunting service, I would question that, because ultimately, again, the whole purpose of threat hunting is to be able to use human ingenuity in order to find and detect the other humans that are on the other side who are attacking us. And lastly, these humans and the data that they have access to need to now be able to use tools and techniques in order to exploit this data. And I'll talk about some of these tools and techniques and some of the common ones we see as well as we continue through the brief. So first, I'm going to show you how kind of we do it at CrowdStrike. So CrowdStrike, we use something called Threat Graph, which is represented by this cloud here. And then you guys may or may not be aware of this, but basically the way that we do endpoint security is we put a single lightweight agent on the machine, and instead of engaging in AV and EDR operations on the machine itself, we send the data to the cloud, and then we send that data to a database called Threat Graph. Within Threat Graph, that's how we enable our own data invisibility. So we have access to somewhere between 30 to 35 million different endpoints across 180 plus countries. We're looking at about 3.5 trillion events per week, and everything we look at is unencrypted. So that's one major advantage for CrowdStrike, is that we're able to look at this large swath of unencrypted data on the endpoint. And something I want to emphasize is the value of data on the endpoint relative to data at the network level. And basically the logic of it is quite simple. Network level data will have more, however, it tends to be less valuable. And it's less valuable, in my opinion, for two reasons. Reason number one is that about 60 to 70% of network traffic is encrypted. And if something is encrypted, what that means is you do not have visibility. And then reason number two is around the notion of attack telemetry. So think about it from the threat actor perspective. Threat actors, at the end of the day, want to attack your endpoints. They want to attack your laptops and your servers and your workloads and your mobile devices. They go through networks to get to your endpoints. So for those two reasons, I do consider the endpoint to be a superior data source when it comes to actually having visibility. The next area over is around human expertise. So again, it doesn't have to be like, it doesn't necessarily have to be this way, right? But here's what CrowdStrike seeks to do. We want to, for us and the way that we engage in threat hunting operations, we want to have a broad swath of different people who have different types of expertise. So we have a lot of people who come from commercial backgrounds, who work for other vendors. We have people like myself who come from military backgrounds, law enforcement backgrounds, as well as expertise in different systems, such as Linux or Mac or Windows, or different disciplines like understanding network forensics, or maybe coming from an application vulnerability background. So again, one advantage, or one thing that you would want to seek to really do in your own threat hunting program, is to have people from a broad set of backgrounds, because you're going to face a broad set of threats. And then the other consideration, in addition to the people's backgrounds, is also the time in which you want to hunt. So, we do 24/7 because we're able to scale as a business and do that. However, that may not be possible for all organizations. Maybe some organizations can only hunt from 9 to 5, and that's okay, right? You do what you can, and it's all about doing what's most efficient for you in the most cost-effective manner. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer. I mean, obviously 24/7 is better than 9 to 5, 5 days a week. But at the same time, again, we all operate within resource constraints. So that, of course, is a major factor. And then lastly, let's talk about some of the tools and techniques that we see. So I'm going to show you two that we leverage, and those are called hypothesis testing and intelligence-driven analytics. So I'm actually just going to load up this slide, and I'll talk about each side. So this first one up here is leveraging threat intelligence to engage in hunting. And leveraging threat intelligence, basically with this, what you are doing is you are leveraging intelligence that you've received from reporting or indicators and things like that in order to engage in your hunting, in your hunts. And the logic behind this one is pretty simple. Let's say you get a threat intelligence report about an attack that happened to one of your peers. If that peer looks like you, if that peer has the same technologies you do, if they're in a similar line of business, then it's very likely that the same adversary that attacked that peer will also attack you. So that is one area where CrowdStrike engages in threat hunting. That's one tool that we use, which is intelligence-driven analytics. And the other is hypothesis testing. So hypothesis testing can be derived from a lot of things. So for example, CrowdStrike does this in a variety of ways. One way that we do it is that we leverage our understanding of other industries to hunt in the industry that you're in. So let's say, for example, that you are a retail organization and CrowdStrike is protecting you as a retail organization. In addition to hunting in your environment, we're also hunting in hundreds of other retail organization environments. And we can take the data that we've seen there, and we can take the trends and statistics that we've seen there and apply that against your organization. So that would be the discipline of hypothesis testing. And sorry, these aren't the only two, but these are two of the more common ones that we leverage. So again, kind of going back to like what is threat hunting, it is a combination of these three things, and you do want to consider each element, whether you're going to build it out yourself or whether you're going to go with a partner provider. So in terms of next steps, here's kind of like, coming back to the beginning, right? And again, let's replace this why CrowdStrike with why threat hunting, because it doesn't necessarily have to be CrowdStrike. Ultimately, our goal is to harden your, the goal is to harden your security posture and also manage cost. So I know from a CrowdStrike perspective, last year we were able to stop about 35,000 potential breaches, and we're well on our way to doing at least about 1.5 times this number this year. And then lastly, you want to be able to manage your cost as well, right? So I know for CrowdStrike, when we engage in complexity reduction, we're able to save customers about 50K on average in terms of save costs and tools, because now you're consolidating into a single tool, into a single pane of glass in a single environment. On average, we save about 120K in cost to the SOC because we're able to do things in a more timely manner. From a talent acquisition and retention perspective, what we are observing is that the average threat hunter, when it comes to their fully loaded costs about 200K. So when I say fully loaded, obviously I mean things like salary and bonuses and whatnot, but I also mean things like PTO and technology costs and healthcare and insurance and 401K matching and all that kind of stuff, right? On average, what we're finding is that the average threat hunter costs about 200K total when you consider the fully loaded cost. And then in terms of risk reduction, that's another benefit of threat hunting as well. And the cost of that is actually just dependent, right? If you remember back to that slide where I showed you the different ransomware demands, it could depend very heavily. The cost could be very high, or it could be somewhere kind of in the the medium to lower range. But ultimately, it kind of depends on the risk to your organization. So that's all I have for today. If you guys are interested in anything that I talked about, if you're ever interested in having a conversation about our threat hunting capabilities and how they can support you, obviously you can reach out to us. But again, this is not the point of today's conversation. The point of today's conversation was to be more so educational and informative about what we've seen from an intrusion perspective. So on that note, are there any questions? Is there anything that I could provide further clarity on for you guys?
Thanks, Jason. And I don't know if you can see the Discord, but I can read questions to you. So one of the questions comes from Steve. Can you speak more about the fact that endpoint data is moving to your cloud unencrypted?
Yes. So think of it like this. Actually, I'm gonna get another slide that does this better. 1 second. So think of it like this. We want to be able to understand exactly what actors are doing. For us to understand what actors are doing, we want to be able to collect a variety of different events. So for CrowdStrike personally, we collect 300 plus events on the endpoint. So by event, I mean things like PowerShell or moving laterally, trying to log in, changing a binary. It could be executing a process. It could be whatever, right? So that's the first portion, is how many events are you collecting? So traditionally, this has been something that's been very hard for AV. Let's take something like McAfee. And again, I'm not trying to knock on McAfee, but I'm explaining why what the difference is between the cloud and then trying to do it all on your endpoint. So McAfee does all AV on the endpoint. And because it does everything on the endpoint, it cannot collect as many events. It collects about 12 events, and it tries to do all of that endpoint security on your machine. And the challenge of that is that the more it tries to do on your machine, the more burdensome it becomes from a data perspective. So the reason CrowdStrike can collect so many events is because instead of trying to do everything on your machine, we take that data, we send it to the cloud, do all the heavy analysis there, and then what our customers do is even when they interface with their endpoints, they're actually interfacing with the data in the cloud. So we can process, we have a much better processing environment here than we can on the endpoint. So that's the reason that we choose to do it that way, is that way we can collect more events, do better data analysis, engage in better protection, and ultimately the goal here is to relieve the burden on the endpoint itself.
Sure. Okay. No, I appreciate that. That answers your question, Steve. I'm sure it does. Let's see. Another question is: do you find it harder for people without a military background to break into cyber, or rather, do you think it makes it easier with that military or law enforcement background?
Here's my personal observation. Let's imagine. Let's see if I can find a slide first. I always try to find slides to explain things.
I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, so I can't find a slide off the top of my head, but let's imagine that there are 3 echelons of thinking: the strategic, the operational, and the tactical. Tactical would be like hands-on keyboard and the ability to code and the ability to engage in malware analysis, whereas like operational would be like working in a SOC, right? So being like a SOC analyst or a vulnerability management person or IR, a lot of what we are kind of in this conversation. Whereas strategic would be much more like higher, like the political level and the geopolitical landscape and kind of the strategic threats and that kind of stuff, right? So what I find is that the military and law enforcement people, they tend to have the better strategic understanding and maybe some operational understanding, but their tactical understanding, their hands-on keyboard, tends to be less mature than people who actually come from industry, like commercial. Whereas a lot of my commercial counterparts are very good with the hands-on keyboard stuff. They know exactly how all the tools work, but then the further up they get towards the strategic, that's where they tend to have a few more challenges. So I think it's just different skill sets. I mean, that's ultimately what it comes down to for me. Like for me personally, I don't know any coding languages. I mean, I understand what I'm looking at if I see command line, but I personally would not be able to enter commands like a hacker. I could watch them and know what they're doing, but I would not be able to do it myself. So I would think of it as just having like different echelons of skill sets, and one is not necessarily better than the other. And that's ultimately why we work in teams, because like not everybody can be good at everything, and you want to ultimately have people have different skill sets. So I guess that's a long way of me saying that no, I do not think a military or a law enforcement background is at all required. I think the law enforcement background helps because of thinking like a bad guy. Same thing with the military background. Like it helps to think like a bad guy, and I think maybe that is a benefit of threat hunting. But at the same time, we also tend to be less technical than a lot of our commercial counterparts. So there's a little bit give and take ultimately.
Sure, no, that makes sense, and I think that's what I've seen. So I 100% agree with that. I spent a year and a half with the SEALs back in the day, and you could see where that strategic approach is very strong. Where maybe on kind of the other end of the spectrum on the technical side, not so much, and operationally, yeah, somewhere kind of a balance in between. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see, another question. Does CrowdStrike have in-house threat hunting teams to hunt for or from external sources like the dark web?
So think of it as there are many different operations within CrowdStrike. So for instance, from an intelligence perspective, we actually collect from a variety of different sources. So our intelligence helps inform our threat hunting. So I've talked a lot about endpoint telemetry. So obviously, yes, CrowdStrike is amazing at the endpoint telemetry piece, but that's not the only area that we get data from. We actually also get data from these 5 other sources. So we get data from our incident response practice. So like when we go and remediate, when we find artifacts and find out about new attacks, we get data there. We get data from our malware and forensic analysis team, who's analyzing about 800,000 unique malware samples per day. Obviously, they're not analyzing all those manually, but a good chunk of them they actually are, particularly when we find new malware. We take that malware apart and we triage it in a separate environment. We do hunt in the dark web, and we call it underground communities because, like, honestly, something that we're seeing these days is that the adversaries are actually using the dark web less, and they're tending to favor things like WhatsApp, Telegram, and Signal more. And the reason they're going more towards these encrypted chat channels is just law enforcement and all the intelligence agencies. They're everywhere in the dark web. And after the shutdown of Alpha Bay and Hansa Market and some of those other bigger ones, a lot of the criminals actually realize, like, okay, we need to stop being in these open environments, and we need to go more to things like encrypted chat channels. So that's actually what we're noticing, is the majority of bad actor activity is now occurring in encrypted chat channels. And then there's also network telemetry. So we have different network devices, as well as honeypots and honeynets that we throw into adversarial infrastructure. And then, of course, there's open source data as well. So I guess that's a long way of me saying that we use multiple data sources, and there is no silver bullet, unfortunately. I mean, I think the closest to a silver bullet we have is the endpoint telemetry. Like, I think of the 6 of these, probably a good 75 to 80% of our valuable stuff comes from endpoint telemetry, but nonetheless, we still have to do the rest because otherwise you don't have a complete picture.
Sure, that makes complete sense. All right, I think that looks like it for questions. A lot of folks saying thank you for your service, and I can echo that. Definitely thank you for all you've done.
Oh, thank you, I appreciate it.
All right, Jason, thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate you sharing. Like I said, I was really excited for you to come back and get to share with everybody after doing the threat briefing with you last week. So yeah, I think everybody found it really helpful and insightful and really interesting. So thanks again, and say hi to Josh if he's listening. If not, we'll talk to him on the other side. But thank you again, and take care.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Have a good day.